Prothro, and I'm introducing myself. A good friend of mine obviously didn't make it and to introduce me, but the most important part is that I did study with Marguerite. I've been a potter most of my life, and that's it. I'm going to start my talk because it's long and I got to get through it. This talk was inspired by a series of events and conversations last spring at NCECA. Perfect. In Kansas City. My voice will predominate in this brief history of the growing historical presence of my teacher, Marguerite Wildenhain, with whom I studied at Pond Farm over the course of 5 summers during the 1970s. Gordon and Jane Brandenstein-Herr began to develop Pond Farm in Guerneville, California in the late 1930s, while Marguerite and her husband Franz were still in Holland. Both Marguerite and Franz have been students of the Bauhaus, the famous German design workshop founded in 1919 by Walter Gropius. But by the time Marguerite met Jane and Gordon, who were in Holland looking for artists to join their Pond Farm venture, she had already moved twice, escaping Nazi persecution. But by 1939, it was imperative to leave Europe altogether. Shortly after meeting the Herrs in Holland, she and Franz decided to accept their offer and got ready to flee to Europe. Marguerite shipped a huge load of pottery to San Francisco, which became the mother lode on which she lived after her arrival. Unfortunately, Franz couldn't get a visa to enter the US, so Marguerite left without him in the spring of 1940. Soon he and all other friends left behind were swept into the vortex of war. Franz and Marguerite did not see one another for nearly 8 years. It was another 2 years before she moved to Pond Farm in 1942 to assist Gordon and Jane with the farm. But it was more years before the wave of European refugees began to arrive after World War II, populating Pond Farm with the Bauhausers who helped to define the history we are now following. Marguerite is, however, the primary subject of this talk, but the rhetorical question, who is Marguerite Wildenhain, suggests other subjective objects as well. Foremost of these subjects will be the relationship of the objective everydayness of concrete reality to the almost instantaneous disappearance of that reality into the past, into some kind of memory and history, and often into some kind of work of art. I loved being at Pond Farm during the summers of my 20s. We camped out with the rest of the pond farmers in the bottomland of the Russian River and worked an intense but relatively short day. We closed up shop at 3 p.m. while there was still time to take long hikes up the hills above Pond Farm and to go to the beach. We ate late, tucked the children into bed in the big J.C. Penney tent we had, and walked up the path to the showers of the Schoolhouse Canyon campground. The path was unpaved and deep in powdery silt. The black peripheral rim of redwood trees etched a spiky western horizon against the night sky, still pale gray at 10 p.m. in mid-July. The same evening silhouette in the winter back east of the skeletal deciduous trees always brings to mind the viscous clarity of Sonoma County twilight. It was centuries ago and this morning, and I am never far from that sensual, thoughtful life. In the mornings, I rode a bike up the hill through Armstrong Redwood State Park. But in spite of the hard ride, I don't think I ever really got started until after coffee at the 10 a.m. break. The fragrance of coffee and clay in the mornings of studio life everywhere always takes me back to those Pond Farm mornings. I don't think I've ever completely left Pond Farm. It is difficult to imagine how it all began. It was such an improbable choice. Yet Marguerite was a dangerous teacher, and it wasn't the easiest of situations. Her absolutist style of teaching and the insistent quality of her line and silhouette could be a brutal master. World history and her interpretation of the Bauhaus, whose rigorous yet intuitively modern line she was herself rejecting, could be blamed, I suppose. She fell under the influence of her self-defined master, Gerhard Marx, so completely some might consider it psychopathic. It was an influence she never escaped, although she tried. The tortured path of this near escape is clearly revealed in the Hansel and Gretel crumbs of the Marx-Wildenhain correspondence. Strangely enough, I think the distance she kept from her own students was a backhanded attempt to save us from repeating the patterns of her own life, so dependent on marks, even if this desire was completely unconscious. It's hard to describe the intense personal experience of Pond Farm without also invoking perhaps a memory washed clean by lapses or encumbered by an emotional latticework of unreliable memory. And it's hard to separate Pond Farm emotion from the simultaneous emotions of my early days as a rock climber on the fabled granite walls of Yosemite and the light-encrusted sandstone of West Virginia. A climber friend of mine once said, "Hunt, you have 2 rats to feed." Perhaps all memory is traumatic, as it invades and wipes clean the present of the past to make way for new experience, or forever warping new experience by clinging tenaciously to the old or to the idea of the past, by never forgetting what we never remembered. We live at our own psychic expense, devouring our memory of ourselves in the moment of our own self-making. What is real? Perhaps this is what Rosalind Krauss was alluding to in one of her famous typological mappings of the expanded fields of art, when she defined kitsch as operating at the nexus of memory and not memory, an object faking a subject, and therefore an unreliable index of reality, but one whose aesthetic remains strangely comforting. This is nostalgia at its worst, never remembered but never forgotten. However, not everything remembered is falsely remembered but never forgotten, is falsely remembered, and a little nostalgia isn't necessarily sentimental, which a college professor of mine defined as believing in a reality in which you never had a part. In any case, it's obvious that for Miss Krauss, good art is somehow related to reality, however ambiguous, and that bad art is always delusional, however certain, and that there is a big difference between what did happen but might be forgotten and what didn't happen but is remembered. It's better to climb without a rope than to get tangled up in knots of self-delusion. Neurobiologists tell us that the brain itself culls bad memories over time to relieve the mind of the burdens of anxiety. Time heals all wounds, as they say. And amazingly enough, in genetically manipulated mice, for instance, when certain genes have been knocked out, the bad memories associated with the smell of a cat can also be eliminated. Unfortunately, the GMO mice that no longer had the bad memories associated with the scent of a cat are quickly eaten by the cats. So not all bad memories are bad for you. Or if you don't have some bad memories, you may soon have no memory at all. So the answer to the titular question, who is Marguerite Wildenhain, will not be final. Besides, Marguerite rarely gave definitive answers herself. She was especially equivocal when questions were asked about friends or about sex or money. She was polite and surprisingly considerate, even affectionate, toward those who legend cites as her most severe critics. A student mentioned Robert Arnson one day during the mid-morning coffee break under the now famous peach tree where we were all gathered. Arnson was one of the artists in the 50s and 60s who challenged the utilitarian pottery vernacular associated with Marguerite, but he and Marguerite were also friends. Marguerite overheard us talking and initiated a conversation about this work, which she did not disparage, but rather suggested was a matter of politics, style, or taste, and told the following story. Once upon a time, Arnson paid a visit to Pond Farm, and it wasn't obvious it was the first time or one of many times that he had been there, but it was obvious that they were friends. Arnson was obviously asking for advice about his future and perhaps her opinion of his talent as well. She said, or so she repeated to us, rapt in attention now, everyone quiet, careful not to say a word as we waited for the other shoe to drop. Well, Robert, she said, you have to decide whether you're going to be a potter or a comedian. And according to Marguerite, Arnson replied, I think I'm going to be a comedian. She was a great storyteller. Her heavily accented but crystal clear English possessed cadence and rhythm as ancient as language itself. And steeped in the oracular traditions of Homer, whom she frequently cited, she was slowly building a cosmology of her own singularity as she gathered her audience around her like a cloak, recapitulating the stories of back in the day and the forevermore. So she said to us that morning after her story, you all have to decide what you are going to do. As for sex, there was nothing, or so she told us. No one is going to get any sex out of me, she snapped one day, when someone crossed the line with some question about Franz Wildenhain, who had been Marguerite's student at the Bauhaus. In her biography, The Invisible Core, published in 1973, she allocates exactly 2 sentences to the 5-year courtship and the nearly 20 years of marriage to Franz. One, that he was the last student admitted to the Bauhaus before the Bauhaus Pottery closed in 1926, and the second, 1 chapter later, in which she wrote, in 1930, Franz Wildenhain and I were married. That's it for sex. Marguerite's maiden name was Friedlander, which she did not reclaim after her divorce from Franz in the early 1950s. Later in the same book, she spends a whole chapter, one of the longest and happiest chapters in the book, describing a trip she took in the early 1940s, walking and hitchhiking up the Northern California coast. In this chapter, she's clearly proud of being an unusual and desirable female. One acquaintance at a truck stop in Mendocino County asks for her hand in marriage, while the proprietor asks if she wants to stay on as a chef, because all French women know how to cook. Well, deep in the Trinity Alps with Trapper Allen, who had invited her along while he checked his trap lines, she makes a point of noting that at least one suspicious farmer's wife asked her, "And what do you want here?" Marguerite was very proud of having been asked that question. In the fantastic Hayden Herrera biography of Archil Gorky, published in 2003, Ms. Herrera describes the European surrealists living in New York City during World War II as the, quote, most sophisticated people ever to walk the face of the earth. Marguerite, although decidedly not a surrealist, was part of this emigre community, and she was cut from the same cloth. She was profoundly sophisticated, deeply imaginative, and capable of deep love. Yet she could be petulant, opportunistic, and when she cut her losses, her tongue was a vicious knife, and she played for keeps. Following the death of Marguerite in 1985, Dean Schwartz, and potter and former student of Marguerite's, discovered in her personal archives a previously unrecorded diary, which had been initiated upon the death in 1926 of Marguerite's technical pottery master, Max Crayon. At the Weimar Bauhaus, every workshop had 2 masters or teachers, one for form and the other for technique or skill. In the pottery workshop, the sculptor Gerhard Marx was form-master, and Max Crayon, a potter in the local village of Dornberg, about 8 miles from Weimar, was skills master. The diary was written in German. Marguerite was completely fluent in 4 languages and could read Latin and Greek. The diary, translated by William Stone, another Pond Farm student, was published in the Dean and Jerry Schwartz anthology, Marguerite Wildenhain and the Bauhaus. In the diary, it was revealed that Marguerite had had a nearly 5-year love affair with Max Crayon, who was married. The affair, which had begun within a year of her becoming a Bauhaus student, ended either upon the death of Crayon or sometime earlier, possibly after Marguerite and Franz became involved, who was almost 10 years younger than Marguerite and nearly 25 years younger than Crayon. It seems certain from a close reading of the diary that during the first year of the Marguerite-Max Crayon relationship, Marguerite became pregnant by Crayon. However, the pregnancy did not continue to term. Indeed, Pond Farm legend had it that there had been a love affair, which took her 5 years to get over. But no one wanted to guess exactly who that lover might have been. In truth, there was some classic Marguerite hyperbole in the 5 years of grief, but she did wait 5 years before marrying Franz. Years after the diary was recovered, but now published in the same anthology, her nephew, Franz Friedlander, wrote, "I understand that the diary that will be part of this book shows a passionate side of Marguerite, and I don't think she will be troubled by that. She was a very passionate person. She was very guarded with people on the outside. She came across as kind of abrupt, but on the inside, she was pretty soft. She was pretty soft." But in the diary, keeping company with some sentimentality and the final farewell of grief, another powerful existential force emerges: destiny. She had to leave Crayon for the next stage of her life. The Bauhaus had closed in Weimar, and she was moving to Dessau without the pottery workshop. And the Bauhaus was moving to Weimar, moving to Dessau without the pottery workshop, which Gerhard Marx and Marguerite were taking to Halle and the Berg Giebelstein. "I kiss the earth for you, my love," she wrote to the deceased Crayon in the diary. But Max Crayon was married, divorce was not possible, and it's highly unlikely that Marguerite would have wanted marriage in any case. Exactly what has been excised by Marguerite from her own record may never be known, but she was sentimental enough about the unfolding of her life as destiny in one continuous self-generated line to do so frequently. I noted the obvious absence of letters from the Marx Wildenhain correspondence in my contribution to the Schwartz anthology, and Ruth Kath, the Luther College professor of German, who translated and published the letters of Gerhard Marx and Marguerite Wildenhain, also noted the absence of certain letters. In multiple entries published in the Schwartz anthology, by the culling of compromising letters is confirmed. Gail Herr writes that after the death of her mother, Jane Herr, in 1952, Marguerite insisted that all Jane's letters to her best friend, Anne McCary, be destroyed so as not to reveal, quote, personal history. This personal history would have included evidence of multiple extramarital affairs engaged in by Gordon Herr with many of the women in the Pond Farm community, including Marguerite. Many of the problems at Pond Farm during the 40s, usually attributed to personality issues and the tensions remnant from the war, could be considered to have arisen from sexual relationships within a very narrow circle of friends, which is probably why Marguerite didn't want to talk about sex. It was a really big deal to Marguerite that she was the only female member of the Bauhaus Pottery Workshop. Most of the female students who attended the Bauhaus were placed in the now world-renowned weaving workshop, including Trudy Germonpré, who kept friendships with Marguerite, Gerhard Marx, and Franz for nearly 50 years until her death in California in 1975. Based on letters I've examined between Gerhard Marx and Trudy, now available in the Smithsonian Archives, it's probable that they too had a love affair during the Bauhaus years when she and Marguerite often posed for Marx, who was married. So I was surprised last fall when I saw in the New York Times of a currently available, very Bauhaus-looking German-made ceramic bowl on sale at the Guggenheim Museum online store. The bowl, it was noted in the Times, was still in production in Germany but had been designed in the 1930s by Hedwig Volgas, a Bauhaus-trained artist. Interesting, I thought. Sure enough, interesting, I thought, this can't be true. Marguerite was the only female student at the Bauhaus Pottery. Sure enough, a bit of Googling later, and it turned out to be not true. However, Miss Bolhagen had studied with people influenced by the Bauhaus during the later 1920s, but had not herself been a student at the Bauhaus. But of course, even more interesting was that the purchase in 1935 by Miss Bolhagen and a partner of a commercial pottery from a woman who had been a student at the Bauhaus Pottery for 1 year, 1920 to 21, Margaret Hayman Lobenstein. Her name, after immigration to the UK during the war and a second marriage, became Greta Marx, no relation to Gerhard. Marguerite/Greta had originally wanted to be in the Bauhaus Pottery Workshop, but had been discouraged in that by Walter Gropius, the founder of the Bauhaus, who recommended she enter the weaving workshop. However, Greta Marx protested when she heard that there was already one female in the pottery workshop, Marguerite. Walter Gropius apparently resisted at first, but then relented. So Marguerite had not been the only female in the pottery workshop. In 2012, the Milwaukee Museum of Art organized a show of the Greta Marx commercial ceramic production created before the purchase of the Hayel Factory for Artistic Ceramics in 1935 by Hedwig Bolhagen, entitled Greta Marx When Modern Art Was Degenerate, a reference to the famous degenerate art show organized by the Nazis. Notes on the museum website state that Miss Marx, then Margaret Hayman, departed the Bauhaus after 1 year in 1921, following disputes with the pottery form master Gerhard Marx. My guess is, however, that she didn't leave the Bauhaus because of Marx. She left because of Marguerite, who was sleeping with their other master, Max Crayon, and the situation became untenable to Greta for whatever reasons. In an International Herald Tribune article, a distant Bauhaus star published in 2009, just before the 2009 MoMA Bauhaus show, and noted the exclusion of Greta Marx from that history, the critic Alice Roththorn postulates that it's, quote, tempting to think that all a successful designer needs is talent and determination, but they're not enough when gender, geography, genre, and timing conspire against you. So how did Marguerite flourish? While Greta Marx did not. Life was very hard for both. They were both Jewish, but they got out of Europe and survived. Max Crayon was not Jewish, but died early while he still had physical strength. No known cause of death was found. Dean Schwartz hints darkly at the mysterious death in editorial comments following a scholarly entry on Thuringian pottery in the anthology, the largest region in which the town of Dornberg is located. He notes the average age for mortality for the Thuringian master potters in the late 19th and early 20th century as being an astonishingly young 36. Crayon was 48 and healthy, perhaps because he did not follow the traditional practice of salting the kilns with their lethal combination of salt crystals, lead, and cobalt mixed into a slurry and thrown into the kiln by hand. Symptoms first appeared in the hands, followed soon by death. Crayon, perhaps more modern and more precautious than his folk art pottery peers, avoided this old-school death for another kind of death, a new malady of the soul, in the words of Julia Kristeva. Perhaps death occurred for him when life became untenable, when he no longer felt he could survive or flourish because his young lover had found a much younger lover herself, or because the remarkable new life given to him unexpectedly by the Bauhaus was now over. At midlife, he had been extracted from a pre-industrial culture in rural Germany into the company of some of the most sophisticated people to walk the earth, and when he was dropped from that circle, he died of a broken heart. Hayden Herrera says as much the same thing for Arshile Gorky, who committed suicide by hanging himself in his Connecticut studio in 1948. One of the final paintings by Arshile Gorky, completed in 1947, is entitled Summation. Last spring at NCECA, just before attending the Jenny Sorkin talk on Marguerite, I dropped into the demonstrating artist hall to watch Richard Notkin. An audience member approached the microphone and asked Mr. Notkin about the political content in his non-utilitarian sculptural work, because she said, "This isn't Shino." So Notkin started talking about the political content of his work and his vision of himself as an artist, and he then, sort of out of the blue, stated unequivocally that content, political or otherwise, and art were two different things. He said the most important thing in art was the art, and not the content, and not just because if the art wasn't there, no one was going to pay any attention to the subject matter. It was because the subject matter had nothing to do with the quality of the art, and that the most important quality in art, the real content, is quality. One does not hear someone say this about quality in art very often, especially in our field. It's hard to say why, but in ceramics, it's hard to separate the signal from the noise or the content from the clay. And unfortunately, clay can be the content, as can process, or at least some kind of content. Throwing, especially, can become so deeply rewarding to those who rarely even make a simple, decent pot, as Marguerite might say, that the process has to be considered in some vicarious way to be much more than process. It becomes cathartic. This is certainly at least one of the reasons ceramics is so seductive as a self-therapeutic medium, and of course, the source of a parochial clay is life sensibility. Raw clay and the traditional utilitarian vessel form are both so easily anthropomorphized, the latter as a vertical, symmetrical, human alignment, and the former clay, so human-like in its physicality, sensual, tactile, transmutable, and sexy. The developments of a clay cult of true believers in a secular age was almost inevitable. Even if young students know nothing about art, about ceramics, or about pottery, they know about the seduction of Demi Moore by John Travolta in the 1990 movie Ghost, and they know it's true. Patrick Swayze, sorry. Glad you all know it. And from my point of view, it was incredible to hear Notkin say the obvious, but even the great Richard Notkin had said nothing, absolutely nothing, about what exactly he meant by art being the most important part of art. Nor did he venture to suggest that art as a profound quality, distinctly empty of any didactic content or social critique, could hold by persistent fortitude and clarity profound ethical revelation. The visceral specificity and the strange otherworldliness of all art foreshadows a simultaneous ambiguity, the mutual exclusivity of clarity and truth. The title of Marguerite's first book is Pottery, Form, and Expression. I never heard her use the word content. However, she did talk about subject matter a good bit, which was usually nature or destiny, a byproduct of nature. But she also frequently addressed Notkin's concept of a de-differentiated art quality and how mysteriously emergent both the form and the expression of art could be. She definitely thought there was a lot of luck to life, but technical skills could help push one's luck. In fact, technique and knowledge of how to make a decent pot might be all we could ever hope to achieve as potters, the rest being in the hands of God, or gods, as she would say. So in spite of her reputation for being completely intractable, she could ask for advice. In 1938, just before the death of her father, who was an international silk merchant, Marguerite traveled to Geneva, where her parents were living, seeking advice about escaping the rising persecution of Jews in Germany and the possibility of war. Her father told her that Switzerland was too small a country for artists, that she needed a larger audience, and that she should go to the US, where her oldest brother lived, having been sent there as a teenager decades earlier to avoid the draft in World War I. She took that advice. Alice Rawthorne, the critic who wrote about Greta Marx, suggested that one reason Greta floundered after her successful life in Germany was that she immigrated to the UK and not to the United States. Marguerite gave good advice, too. She never talked about money, as noted earlier, probably because her pockets were deeper than she wanted anyone to know. But she always advised us to travel light and keep your overhead low. Her favorite word and subject was form, perhaps some of it unnecessarily so, like ritualized social protocol, or very narrow, deep criticisms of elementary tools of daily life, like a clunky cup, for instance, or a ballpoint pen. Strangely enough, however, I would not have been a student of hers if this kind of prosaic discrimination were not the case. Several years after I'd become her student, I asked her why she had accepted me in the first place. By then, it was obvious that I was the only student in attendance who had neither previously studied with her, nor with one of her former students, nor had a deep personal connection, as did Paul Lanier, the son of a San Francisco sculptor, Ruth Asawa, an old friend of Marguerite's. Well, she said to me that afternoon, in the garden of her house, after the close of our regular workday, you wrote me a letter with a fountain pen, you called me Mrs. Wildenhain, and you had a French postmark. So I thought you might be French. She hated ballpoint pens. She deeply resented being called Marguerite by those without a formal introduction, and she loved France, or the French. It wasn't obvious from her book that these were some of the many things she meant by form, at least not as obvious as her emphasis on technique. Pond farm technique had been legendary since Marguerite arrived in the US in the 1940s. Stories about her throwing ability and her knowledge abound in all historical treatments. Years after I was at Pond Farm, I read an apocryphal description of Joseph Albers by Robert Rauschenberg, who was a student of Albers at Black Mountain College. Of Albers, Rauschenberg is reputed to have said, he taught with a combination of knowledge and intimidation. This is Marguerite exactly, which she would hate to admit because she thought that Albers and Laszlo Boholy-Nagy over-intellectualized art and design and destroyed the real Bauhaus, the earliest iteration of the Bauhaus, the Weimar Bauhaus. However, she rarely talked about technique. She just demonstrated technique as an unequivocal fact. Yet a rumored story around Pond Farm told of a student who innocently asked Marguerite if she taught raku. No, replied Marguerite, I teach students. She was wary of being pinned down and refused to prescribe exactly what constituted form or expression, only that it was irresponsible for a culture to teach form without some kind of technique or expression without self-discipline. Art was magic, talent ephemeral and fragile. In the end, students were responsible for developing their own gifts, in whatever form their art might find expression. Yet, in spite of this humanistic insistence that she taught students, some students felt abandoned by Marguerite at Pond Farm. These students floundered helplessly within the structure of her famous steps, the series of forms everyone had to work through before moving on to other projects, often of their own devise. A small number of students never made it past these steps, out of 20 or so, in the course of an entire summer. Since all clay was recycled at Pond Farm for Marguerite to use later in the year, a Pond Farm urgent legend developed of razor blades having been thrown into the clay at the end of one summer, leaving no doubt in the minds of those of us who thrived that there were some who did not. Technically, she was the absolute master. I didn't really know that when I wrote her that letter from Paris. But as Volgas supposedly said, if you want to learn to surf, go to Hawaii. If you want to learn to throw, go to Pond Farm. And even more recently than that apocryphal line during a workshop at Anderson Ranch just before he died, Peter Volgas told a friend of mine taking his class that pond farmers could throw like hell, but were all dirt poor. There was truth to this line, but a high percentage of pond farm students have remained potters for entire careers with little support from school salaries or anything other than modest part-time employment. This is a substantial achievement for Marguerite and for pond farmers, especially considering how few art school grads come anywhere close to earning a living from art. But to clarify her complexity and her lack of wildly misrepresented dogmatism, I think she would have profoundly liked the moving scene in Ghost, but she died before the movie came out. Marguerite loved the sexy and slightly occult publicity photographs Otto Hegel, yet another European emigre, took of her and Pond Farm over a 4-year period in the late 50s. All these photographs are now archived at the University of Arizona. One of the most famous photographs is this montage of her hands in multiple throwing positions, which now appears on the dust jacket of the new Jenny Sorkin book, Live Form. These photographs take a lot of their impact from the language of sensuality, physical engagement, and emotional understanding that Sorkin is defining as uniquely feminine, if not female, and they were shot more than 30 years before Ghost. They are also far in advance of the contemporary aesthetic turn toward materiality, the embodied, and the haptic, although frankly, ceramics has never disavowed the sensuality of process. For instance, at a recent Volgas show at the Museum of Art and Design, there is some terrific footage, also filmed during the 50s, of Peter Volgas throwing and making a stack before an enormous audience. Interestingly, this Otto Hegel photograph, the one of the hands, now nearly 60 years old, is also used on the dust jacket of the Glenn Adamson book, The Craft Reader, published in 2009. Before I read Pottery and Expression, I'd read the Leach book, A Potter's Book, as well as The Unknown Craftsman by Suitsu Yanagi. So I was familiar with the terms wabi, sabi, and shibui, which, if somewhat doctrinaire, had all struck me as completely accurate expression of thingness. But the canonization of Shino had also always struck me as obtuse. But still, there remains resonance for me in the cryptic, sensual, poetic language of Japanese Korean aesthetics and the image of an imperfect perfect. Once again, I was being hosted by Marguerite at one of her afternoon soirees, and I asked her what she thought about these terms and Japanese pottery generally. I knew that she had been at Black Mountain College with Leach, Yanagi, and Hamada, although she never talked much about it. However, she did say fairly regularly that she felt trapped in the East Coast cities when she first arrived in 1940, and that the forests in North Carolina especially were claustrophobic. So I don't think her memories of Black Mountain College were as fond as her memories of Trapper Island in the more arid and higher mountains of Northern California. She loved California. For one thing, it reminded her of France. In her biography, there is no mention of Black Mountain College. Besides, legend had it that she said of Leach that he couldn't throw, and of Hamada that he had no sense of form. So there wasn't much left for her to say about Anglo-Japanese aesthetics, but I thought I would ask. After a moment, she said, well, I too know that life is not perfect. And that was it. Much attention is being paid these days to Pond Farm, the Bauhaus, and Black Mountain College, as well as to a revival of many artists once marginalized by race, genre, geography, or timing, like Marguerite or Ruth Asawa. As a student at Black Mountain College, Ruth Asawa had worked with the Bauhaus immigrant cohort, including Trudy Guermont-Pré, as well as with Buckminster Fuller, from whom she probably received her first insights into woven wire. Sarah Archer has written of the reemergence of Ruth Asawa in contemporary art markets. However, she notes in her 2015 essay in the Journal of Contemporary Craft that interest paid to the Asawa estate of standalone works in wire is significantly greater than that paid to the collaborative public works she executed later in life, often with children as helpers. Ms. Archer argues that the market favors the singular discrete works over the collectively generated public work because the market doesn't appreciate the value of collective or communal work, especially if women artists have conceptualized these works. In Live Form and in her recovery of the legacy of Marguerite as an important mid-20th century artist, Jenny Sorkin focuses on the community building, process-based pedagogy supposedly at work at Pond Farm, rather than on the ceramic works of art made by Marguerite, whose work she shares with Asawa, works which have a sense for the tactile, the sensuality of compressed time, and an emotional recapitulation of having been made by hand, specifically by a feminine hand. Both artists, however, have been neglected or diminished by mainstream markets and critics, and marginalized, if not completely neglected, by academic research or theory. Yet each has remained in circulation of some sort, kept afloat by alternative markets, by family trust, and the power of their authoritative presence. This work is resistant to disintegration. It remains intact, awaiting renewal or reinterpretation by the ever-flowing stream of a new audience. So why did Ms. Sorkin focus on the qualities of community rather than the qualities of Marguerite's work? Or from another perspective, why doesn't the so-called market, certainly some kind of representative of the ever-flowing audience, value community? As Ms. Archer notes blithely, probably because an auction house or a gallery can sell a discrete work of art, but it's a lot harder to sell a community, especially if the community or public art isn't portable. But it's true also that attention is being turned to the social and physical spaces of creative life, like the Bauhaus, Black Mountain College, and Pond Farm, in search for models of pedagogical excellence and the starting point of experience for learning and for art. Why was the learning in these schools so profoundly deep and the influence so broad? And why were they all so short-lived? Pond Farm lasted far longer than the Bauhaus or Black Mountain College, and it barely lasted 30 years. Marguerite's life is part of a larger pattern, argues Anthony Veerkamp of the San Francisco office of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Pond Farm is an evolution, he says, in how we're thinking about historic significance. It's important to make room for untold stories, underrepresented aspects of our past. Within the last 3 years, there's been an exhibition featuring Marguerite and her life at Pond Farm entitled A Potter's Life at the SFO Museum in San Francisco, and Pond Farm has been listed on the National Register of Historic Places, while in a commensurate process, it's been designated as a national treasure by the National Park Service. And now the terrific Jenny Sorkin book, Live Form, references the terrific Jenny Sorkin book, Live Form, Women's Ceramics and Community, published in 2016. The term live form references a line in Marguerite's first book, Pottery, Form, and Expression, published in 1959, in which Marguerite challenges the potter to animate the form of the work and to create a generative form, a self-sustaining, autonomous, and expansive form, a live form. The Stewards of the Coast and Redwoods is a nonprofit organization which, in the absence of state funding, essentially controls Armstrong Redwood State Park and is a significant player in land use planning and the environmental policy in western Sonoma County. Pond Farm is the most significant architectural feature in Armstrong Redwoods, and its preservation has long been a touchstone for the stewards, particularly for its remarkably effective and imaginative executive director, Michelle Luna. She and Anthony Veerkamp of the National Trust supervised the complex administrative and academic task of initiating the application for inclusion in the National Registry. Janet Graysick, a landscape architect in Sebastopol, California, wrote most of the concise and comprehensive arguments in support of the application defining Pond Farm as a site of artistic and cultural relevance and associating it with a national and international context. And it's important to note that few in the ceramic art community, much less the mainstream academic art community, either participated in or had any idea that these efforts were being undertaken. Michelle Luna is a midwife by training, but Anthony Veerkamp is an art historian, although he had never heard of Marguerite before he started looking for sites like Pond Farm. Quote, "There is a notion of 6 degrees of separation," he told me over the telephone, "but here at Pond Farm, we are just one person away from a movement, the Bauhaus, which has had a profound effect on all of us." Nicole Mullen, the SFO museum curator, largely responsible for A Potter's Life, Marguerite Wildenhain at Pond Farm, related to me the much more emotional than usual airport audience response, largely confirming Mr. Veerkamp's sense that the personal history of Marguerite and her studio, Pond Farm, tell a story that is profoundly meaningful to most people. The mythic saga of her fortitude and the persistent courage in the face of a seemingly implacable destiny, the excruciating, heart-rending losses followed by the most unexpected and miraculous self-renewal, may be the oldest story of them all. In an essay on Pond Farm describing the efforts made on behalf of the Marguerite Wildenhain legacy by the National Trust, published last November in the San Francisco Chronicle, John King, the Chronicle's urban design critic, channels Veerkamp. "It's unique," he writes, "the way this story played out above Guerneville through one woman who defied Nazis and bureaucrats and the expectations of her times. But the underlying saga has been part of America from the start. Honoring that truth in all its varied forms can only help inspire new and unpredictable stories to come. In an oral interview project initiated last year by the consortium of sponsors responsible for the listing of Pond Farm on the National Register, the detailed questionnaire directs the conversation less towards ceramic training received by pond farmers than to their experience of the natural environment and their feelings for the physical workspaces in the studio. Of particular emphasis in the focus guidelines for the interview were student memories of the architectural site of Pond Farm, nestled in a small hanging valley just above a virgin redwood forest and just below the expansive ridgelines radiating to the east and west, a ridgeline of madrone, eucalyptus, and the widely spaced, powerful black-green silhouettes of live oaks, altogether tucking Pond Farm into the nooks and crannies of its own self-defined embrace. I can still hear Marguerite telling her own story of the naive but hopeful visitors to Pond Farm who would ask her, "How did you find this place?" "Well," she says rhetorically, "you don't find a place, you make a place." When Anthony Veerkamp first walked into the tall, nearly Gothic spire of Pond Farm Barn, he told me he realized that this was an astonishing space, whose sublime yet architecturally simple and inexpensive fabrication with mostly salvaged materials was magical. Interestingly enough, in the Jenny Sorkin talk, little of this was mentioned. Professor Sorkin has her own story to tell, a story of recovered causation and of the process of becoming, but it isn't the same one being told by the stewards. When Marguerite first arrived at the Pond Farm site, she found a virtually abandoned and dilapidated 19th century ranch with few livable dwellings surrounded by the magnificent Sonoma County Coast Range. The Hers had already rebuilt the least dilapidated building for their family and were running a ranch, in part to keep Gordon out of the draft. Marguerite camped out for nearly a year before she and Gordon completed the house she lived in for the rest of her life. Marguerite loved camping and hiking and being outside and living on the edge. She was very proud of her ability to live a nearly aboriginal Neolithic way of life, in spite of being raised and educated in one of the most physically secure, refined cultures to exist, the pre-World War I French bourgeoisie. In her biography, she says she knew immediately the moment she arrived that this was a place where someone could make pots. Professor Sorkin is the most recent contributor to the significant academic scholarship in the years since Marguerite died in 1985, returning her and Pond Farm to at least the fringes of mid-20th century ceramic art history. Dr. Billy Sessions, recently retired from Cal State San Bernardino, helped initiate this reclamation with her Ripples project in the late 1990s and early 2000s, organizing in 2002 the first traveling Marguerite show since her retrospective at Cornell in 1980, and providing the bedrock research gleaned by Anthony Veerkamp and Janet Graysick for the National Trust application. The title of the show, Ripples, alludes to the widening influence of Marguerite and Pond Farm on generations of her students. Dr. Sessions never met Marguerite, who died a decade before Billy started her research, nor had she never even heard her name before her professor at Penn State, Paul Boland, suggested in Billy's first grad school art education class that she do research on a lesser-known art educator. When she found Marguerite, Dr. Sessions told me, "Wow," was her first response. "She's amazing. Who is Marguerite Wildenhain?" I think Marguerite would have loved Billy, but it would have been a match made in heaven and in hell. In 2007, South Bear Press published the magisterial compendium Marguerite and the Bauhaus, an eyewitness account. Constructed more than edited by Dean and Geraldine Schwartz, this remarkable assemblage compiles a trove of historical data, accurate chronologies, memoirs and essays, including oral interviews, photographs, long thought lost, and an array of reproduced Marguerite drawings. Marguerite Wildenhain is very, very lucky to have had Dean Schwartz as a student and biographer, and Jerry, his wife, as co-editor. And now the addition of the Jenny Sorkin Scholarship encapsulated in a terrific new book, The Work of a Decade, Live Form, Women, Ceramics, and Community, is broadly redefining the legacy of Marguerite, and in addition, the careers of both M.C. Richards and Susan Peterson, in context perhaps not completely unexpected. After the last few decades of an emotionally bankrupt social art history, the rejection of expressionism, and turf wars still being waged in academia on the dead-end streets of post-structuralist theory, one might have expected blowback. Live form is part of this blowback. Emotions are back, and so is experience and expression. In spite of this, neither Michelle Luna of the Stewards of the Coast nor the National Trust were particularly interested in the specific quality of Marguerite's work. Each accepted the legacy of assumed high quality and her place in the 20th century. All the work in the SFO show came from one collection of Forrest Merrill in the Bay Area. Nicole Mullen, the SFO curator, noted the remarkable attention paid by the general airport audience of non-professionals to the story of her life, her courage, tenacity, and her commitment. Most of the airport audience would probably have been surprised to hear of her estrangement from ceramic art history. The audience at the SFO Museum did not read her work as reactionary or diminished by being utilitarian or by not being sculpture, and certainly not for having been made by a woman. They saw her work as unique, deeply skilled, and beautiful. Most viewers didn't see the work in any art historical context. They didn't have a theory of art within which to define their viewing experience. The audience saw the work as profoundly realized and a testament to individual achievement under harsh circumstances. Jenny Sorkin suggests that one problem with the field of ceramics is it's been under-theorized, and in many ways she's right. But she and Billy Sessions are lucky this is so, or Marguerite wouldn't have been so easily cherry-picked as under-theorized or underappreciated PhD material. On the other hand, after Joseph Albers ascended to the directorship of the Bauhaus, and Johannes Itten, who had developed the famous foundations class, was replaced by Moholy-Nagy, Gerhard Marx and, of course, Marguerite thought the Bauhaus was ruined by having become over-intellectualized and over-theorized. Marguerite hated the theories of Yanagi, although she herself glamorized the unknown craftsmen and women who produced the indigenous folk art of the Peruvian and Bolivian high plateaus and pitched her own anti-bourgeois, anti-industrial theories. Nothing is more bourgeois than wishing you weren't. After all, her first book, Pottery, Form, and Expression, is largely a plea and a quest for meaning in a demoralized, industrialized world. The potter must move, she says, quote, toward a basic understanding of the essence of life dedicated to an idea that is not based on success or money, but on human independence and dignity. She had plenty of her own theories, though, which she didn't think of as theories. She is a romantic, weaned on arts and crafts rhetoric, on Ruskin. She decided to join the Weimar Bauhaus by reading the woodcut posters Lionel Feininger designed for Walter Gropius to advertise the Bauhaus. There was going to be a new school, a school in which artists and craftsmen would conceive and create the new building of the future, which will embrace architecture and sculpture and painting in one unity. And like all romantics, she believed in luck and destiny. About her Bauhaus decision, she wrote in her autobiography, quote, throughout my life, the fates have been kind to me in spite of all. They've always nearly pushed me in the right direction at the right time. Here too. Marguerite definitely trusted her instincts, and she felt that life and art emerge from whatever happens, however it happens, and in whatever form and expression. But one has to be open to it. In 1974, after my third summer at Pond Farm, Marguerite wrote me a postcard. I'm glad the summer was meaningful for you, she wrote. That is how it should be always. Only one is not always open to it or ready to understand what is given to you. Those certain moments when it clicks inside of you, one never forgets. Oh, believe, at least it was with me. When I first met the potter, and now architect William King, it was obvious that he had a unique and special relationship with Marguerite, but it took me a long time to find out why. After having spent several summers at Pond Farm, Bill just showed up at Marguerite's house one afternoon in the winter of 1970 for a visit. After tea and some talking about surgery she was expecting to undergo, and what was he doing at her house in the middle of the winter, a rainy season, when he should have been at home working, she asked him the stunning question, would you be interested in staying at Pond Farm for a few months to help me out with the surgery? Bill had dropped out of school and had no real agenda, so he said yes. From that point on, Bill was bulletproof and forever changed. In his own entry in the Schwartz anthology, Bill recalls conversations he and I have had over the years in which his experience of her sounds like something out of the Middle Ages. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, for instance. Bill writes, it is the riddle of her nature that continues to intrigue. We share anecdotes and experiences as we try to unravel the codex bequeathed to us. Like a tangible volume laid between us, we pore over it. Our experience of Marguerite was different, but to each of us, a challenge has been passed, like a sacred relic, whose meaning is self-evident because it is synonymous with your own, and one that asks an accounting of its trust, unquote. I think Jenny Sorkin thinks Pond Farm was a cult, and pond farmers were too, and remain true believers, and certainly writing like this, of a mysterious gift given and accepted with demanding existential terms, certainly suggests that that's the case. However, we all shared the same but slightly different experiences of Marguerite over many years, and is the bonding of pond farmers any more occult or self-defining, say, in shared exclusivity than the graduates of an Ivy League school or any other self-selected, self-defining cohort? Pond Farm wasn't a cult, but it wasn't a theory either. Theory is just repositioning after the fact. Here's some Peter Volgas theory. Here's some Peter Volgas theory. When you're experimenting on the wheel, there are lots of things you cannot explain. You just say to yourself, the form will find its way. It always does. That's what makes it exciting. The minute you begin to feel you understand what you're doing, it loses the searching quality. You reach a point where you are no longer concerned with keeping this blob of clay centered on the wheel and up in the air. Your emotions take over, and what happens just happens. Pottery has to be more than an exercise in facility. The human element, expression, is usually badly neglected. Volgas sounds exactly like Marguerite, yet the works made by each inhabit parallel universes. The real source of the neglected legacy of Marguerite is that she was completely eclipsed by Peter Volgas, but so is everyone else, male and female. This is the problem with destiny. It can take you or it can leave you. Destiny might matter to us, but we don't matter to destiny. In live form, as well as in her essays in Revolution in the Making, the publication accompanying the Hauser-Wirth-Schimmel show in Los Angeles last year, of abstract sculpture by women between 1947 and 2016, Professor Sorkin, who helped curate that show, argues that mid-20th century female artists have been denied attention for powerful work executed often with unique or underappreciated materials from a very specific, narrowly defined art history, and that they were excluded from this history because they were women. And in this demythologizing of the canon and the recontextualization of the center from the periphery, she has a lot of company. For instance, Theories of the Non-Object by Monica Amor, published last year, follows a similar theoretical arc recovering the Bauhaus influence to geometric non-object works executed by artists living in Brazil, Argentina, and Venezuela in the decades after World War I, II. In the consideration of the German-born Venezuelan artist Gertrude Goldsmith, known as Gigo, whose work Reticulera has a strong presence in the Revolution show, Professor Amor retroactively cites the work of Gigo in the light of philosopher Elizabeth Grosz and the feminist writer Lucy Irigaray, while associating the rhizomatic-like growth pattern of the Reticulera with a post-structural social critique of the shantytowns around Caracas, Venezuela. Gigo was born in 1912 and died in 1994. She followed a path remarkably parallel to Marguerite, although they certainly never met. Gigo did not train with Bauhaus architects, but she studied architecture and engineering with Paul Bonatz in Stuttgart and immigrated in 1939, escaping the Nazis to Venezuela. Some years later, possibly under the influence of Buckminster Fuller's concept of a self-supporting framing technique called tensegrity, she began to create the extended non-volumetric and space frame-like sculptures she named Reticulera. Were the Reticulera social critique of the newly emerging shantytowns around Caracas, or are both the shantytowns and the concept of tensegrity dependent on deeper structural patterns of growth that describe phenomenon as diverse as aspen groves, neural networks, or the random burgeoning forth of a shantytown? Jenny Sorkin argues that Jenny Sorkin includes Marguerite as one of these excluded women. But Marguerite is not an abstract sculptor, nor did she consider pottery to be an abstract art, although she is definitely a cubist in sculptural terms, and she wrote and talked to us endlessly about the growth patterns of nature. I'm sure she wouldn't have thought of pottery as a non-object either, but to my memory, we never talked about it. There was surprisingly little talk about any kind of art outside the context of what we were doing and what we were making at the time. Jenny is right about that. Pond Farm was remarkably insulated from much focus on anything other than the work being made and the quality of that work. Although Marguerite is not in the Revolution show, two Bay Area women tangentially associated with Pond Farm are Ruth Asawa and Claire Falkenstein. Each was given an enormous presence in the first room of the museum-sized gallery in the LA show. In addition, and most importantly for me, most importantly it seems to me, for Dr. Sorkin, these artists have not been given credit for the prescience of an alternative artistic stance to minimalism, conceptualism, and to the overly glamorized post-studio practice celebrated by Glenn Adamson, for one, in an NCECA lecture as recently as 2010. In fact, however, the concept of a successful artist working alone in the studio, whatever the nature of their technical practice, is nearly obsolete. Virtually all of the living artists in the Revolution show have expansive studio practices with multiple assistants, often on a near industrial scale. Many artists who favor a materialized, embodied, process-based aesthetic have become producers of elaborate installations and videos, like the sometime potter, urban theorist, and social reformer Theaster Gates. Theaster Gates, for instance, employs dozens of highly skilled artists to execute his quasi-religious performance art. Theaster gets a lot of mileage out of being a potter or having been a potter in his charismatic, mystical performances about thingness, about making, about the place of the long-forgotten use of our hands and tools, and our nostalgia for quality. According to Theaster, quality for him became an issue when he realized that no one was buying his pots, that he was trying to make pots that looked like pots made by mostly white American potters imitating long-dead Japanese potters. Then he discovered work made in the 19th century by a South Carolina slave named Dave, whose pots blew everyone out of the water, the Japanese, the white Americans, but mostly his own. So he asked himself, what am I going to do? What can I do? How can I make something out of nothing and not nothing out of something that's filled with quality? And he thought, what is more nothing than the shoeshine stand of a black man in the South, or the black roofing tar his father used to repair roofs? He started making something out of the nothingness of blackness and telling the story of an empty space that fills with people who find quality in a new life, which others seek to replicate, because that quality is organized and recognized as meaningful to their lives. If for Jenny Sorkin, the embodied materiality of tactility, ephemerality, and the often ancient solitary processes of making and forming describes a non-canonical other, it is also routinely described as women's work. So she argues these processes too were discriminated against. If in the minor arts, the title of the new Theaster Gates show at the National Gallery in Washington, one can find an unanticipated beauty in the miraculous everydayness of the roofing tar. I got 1 minute here, so I'm going to encapsulate some stuff. In the wall text of the SFO Museum, show Marguerite had last year, written by Nicole Mullen, I noted an interesting and very problematic digression from my memory of Pond Farm, as well as from the specific pedagogy of Marguerite as expressed in all her books. In an essay published, I'm having a hard time doing this in 1 minute, and to the layman, to the SFO audience, I'm going to eliminate all of that and just go to the very last. In spite of being utilitarian, Marguerite certainly thought that the difficult, extended experience of learning how to make pottery, which would consistently generate in others the emotional response we call quality, would also constitute a moral education. But she was most interested in the specific uniqueness of quality, in why this and not that. And she wanted her students to be able to make a living from selling their work. She felt deeply that the way of life of a potter was itself a moral stance of independence and dignity, and that the pots produced by well-trained potters would bear witness to this moral stance through their uniqueness, clarity, power, and restraint. In spite of being utilitarian, they would not be commodities in the most banal sense of that word, nor would they be empty of meaning by being the humble objects of daily life. In fact, these humble objects become the meaning of world. Just as architecture, the architecture of Pond Farm, is itself a space which demands response and the participation of all of our senses, the humble space of utilitarian pottery becomes a holding action, however ephemeral against process, and is resistant to disintegration. Catharsis is a regenerative process, but it need not be collective. Art must be collective in the gathered response of its quality, but this doesn't necessitate community. Marguerite lived a long, extraordinarily rich life within a narrow plane, and she lived consistently between the past and the future in the infinite now. She was not dominated by the past, nor overly anxious of the future. She kept her overhead low, and she traveled light. In the end, she refused to replace the battery in her heart pacemaker or to upgrade that life-extending device. Her work remains, bearing testament to clarity, restraint, and a distinctive, calculated freedom. Her work puts to shame any derisive, conceptualized use of the word commodity, but reminds us that we are here now in a world of our own choosing. Thank you very much. Tony, up a minute or two? A couple minutes if anyone has a question. Yes. Yes. I've been a potter my whole life with that tiny amount of part-time teaching.
Did you ever feel close to Marguerite?
Consistently. Not obvious. But not the real ghost, if that's what you mean. No, she's and I have pots of hers, of course. She's with me every day. Yes. Not quite, but it's on the edge of becoming a public space with prepared documentation about her life and a collection there, and maybe turning into a new state-run school. All right, thanks a lot.